of novelist Hualing Engel, and that'll be here in the club as an evening event. Now, on to our event of the day, and I'm really pleased to say I have a good novel to read starting this evening. Christopher New was a philosophy professor here at Hong Kong U for 30 years. He is a novelist, lives partially in Berlin and in Bangkok now, which sounds like a good background for places to write novels. But I think he fell upon this one in doing some historical research about what Hong Kong was like at the height of the British Empire. So he's here to tell us about the history and also a little bit about his book. He'll be here after the event to sign books and to answer any further questions. Christopher?
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here again. I think the last time I was here was when you were celebrating your 60th anniversary, and now it's, I learn, your 70th anniversary. It looks like this is becoming a regular event, in which case I think I should advise you that I may not be available for your 100th anniversary. But then I don't know how many of us here today can guarantee to be here then anyway. What I want to talk about is prostitution and prejudice, with particular relation to, of course, the Hong Kong demi-monde in the middle and late 19th century. I'd like to start with a brief personal note. My late good friend Carl Smith, who was a noted Hong Kong and Macau historian, drew my attention back in the 90s to some cuttings he had culled from the China Mail of the 80s, that is the 1880s, about a murder-suicide that occurred on Gage Street, not 500 yards from here, in 1883. A German-speaking single European woman who was entertaining her lover, who was a German marine captain who was due to take his boat up the Pearl River. And she was singing. Her friend, with whom she shared her house, was playing the piano. There were servants present and other people present. It was a convivial and relaxed atmosphere, and the German sea captain took out his pistol and shot first his mistress, whose name was Franziska Berger, or perhaps Bayer. The spelling differs in different accounts, and then shot himself. Well, of course, that intrigued me. I wanted to know what could have been going on in Hong Kong at that time, which brought about this tragedy. And so I also thought there must be a novel here, and I would like to write a novel about Hong Kong at that time. Having written novels about Hong Kong in the 20th century, I thought something earlier would be interesting. And so I started doing some research. When I say doing some research, I should say that I started finding out what other researchers had already found out. I must mention here Elizabeth Sin, Susanna Ho, Norman Miners of Hong Kong U, who all have contributed to the research on this period and this topic. So I'm going to tell you something, first of all, about the grades of prostitution and also the degrees of prejudice that existed in Hong Kong at that time, and also to tell you something about the trafficking of women, which was also a big factor in Hong Kong and elsewhere in the British Empire at that time. Now, this woman was a German-speaking woman, presumably of German or Austrian origin, and I'm going to come back to her later on when we come to the later part of my talk. Now, prostitution in Hong Kong then was really in three layers. There were the brothels for the local population and the transient population of seamen and petty traders. The girls that were in those brothels were largely from the mainland, from the Philippines, from Japan, and they were, at least in the case of the Chinese girls, they were very often girls who had been sold by their parents to a purchaser who then had absolute right over them. One contract says whether the child lives or dies is the will of heaven. And these girls were very often, if they were not used as domestic drudges or concubines, were sold into brothels. The Hong Kong government took a fairly relaxed attitude towards them. I'm speaking generally because the attitude changed over time. But at the time we're speaking of, they took a fairly relaxed attitude towards these brothels. They were supposed to be licensed, but many, of course, were not. And the girls in the brothels had a fairly unhappy life. There is one celebrated account in the newspapers which describes how one girl who was so diseased that she was no more use to the brothel was taken up onto the hillside and left to die. Very often they weren't taken up onto the hillside, but simply pushed out onto the streets. That's the lowest grade. Then we come to the next grade, which is the brothels reserved for the garrison. The regulations governing them were much more strict and were enforced more strictly, although there was certainly room for corruption and undercover work. They were brothels which, as the regulation, the preamble to the regulation for them stated, were designed to provide clean Chinese women for the use of British sailors and soldiers. You can't get much more brutally frank than that. These girls were subject to medical inspection, and this rule was more or less laxly enforced according to the authorities at the time. They were, that is, the brothels, were obliged to pay a tax to the government, and for that reason the girls were known as Queen's women, since it was Queen Victoria on the throne. I'm sure Her Majesty would not have been amused. And they were also known as big numbers, because outside each brothel was a number, and the client had to inscribe the name of the prostitute he visited and the time he visited her, so that should there be any venereal disease, it could be traced back to that prostitute and action taken. There was quite a lot of venereal disease in the garrison, so I think that regulation was as necessary in principle as it was ineffective in practice. Then we come up to the higher grade of prostitute, and perhaps I shouldn't say prostitute here, because these were women who could choose their clients. Perhaps we should use the word courtesan. These were single European women, like the lady in Gage Street who was murdered by her lover. These so-called single European women were so described as a euphemism in order to avoid letting the side down, that is the racial side down, by admitting that there actually were women who were Europeans and also prostitutes. They were also obliged to live in a certain area, namely, mainly Gage Street, Hollywood Road, Lyndhurst Terrace. They were also obliged to have medical inspections, although that regulation seemed to be rather laxly applied. And they were generally having a much better life of it than the women below them and in the prostitution hierarchy. They were not very many in number, but they did service the middle-class European clientele which existed in Hong Kong. And we must remember that at the time we're speaking of, there was an enormous imbalance of men to women in Hong Kong. There were many men from Europe who came out without wives. There were many laborers that came from the mainland who came without wives. So there was a demand for prostitution, and it was satisfied. Now, I'd like to come back now for a moment to the case of Franziska Berger, because this is where things become delicate and interesting at the same time. What was a German-speaking woman doing in Hong Kong, where after all there were very few Germans? How did she come there? Well, I think the best way to get a handle on this is to quote a few lines from a poem by Rudyard Kipling. He published it in 1888, that is 5 years after the murder-suicide I recounted at the beginning. And it's called The Ballad of Fisher's Bazaar. It is, of course, being Kipling, set in India. It is set, in fact, in the dockside of Calcutta. And the ballad describes a boarding house, or perhaps I should say a bawdy house, where the presiding genius was a lady called Anne of Austria. Why Anne of Austria? Well, he goes on to say, from Tarnow in Galicia to Juan Bazaar she came, to eat the bread of infamy and take the wage of shame. To eat the bread of infamy and take the wage of shame clearly indicates that she was a prostitute. But why Tarnow? Where's Tarnow? Where's Galicia, for that matter? Well, Tarnow was a town in the Austro-Hungarian province of Galician, Galicia in English, and it is now part of Poland, and is now called Tarnice. The province of Galician roughly straddled what is now Ukraine and Poland. Now it happens that at that time, in that century, owing to pogroms, owing to political unrest, owing to economic downturn, there were many Jews in Galician who were starving. In fact, according to Edward Bristow, who has written the authoritative book on this, up to 5,000 Jews were starving in Galician between 1880 and 1914 annually. I don't trust figures which are rounded up like 5,000, but I think we can certainly assume that there was great poverty and hardship for the Jewish community, in particular in Galician at that time. This was exacerbated because, of course, many people, many of the men, migrated from Galician, and the women were left alone. Now, there was a supply and there was a demand. There was a demand in all sorts of places in South America, in Europe, and in the Far East for women in brothels, or at least for prostitutes. And there was a supply. So a trade grew up, and a small number in terms of the world trade in women, but a significant number in terms of the Jewish community, of Jewish girls were trafficked from Galician as far as Rio de Janeiro, Buenos Aires, Constantinople, Alexandria, London, New York, and once the Suez Canal had been opened in 1869, to the outposts of the British and the American Empire, that is to Manila, to Shanghai, to Colombo, to Bombay, to Calcutta, to Harbin, and eventually to Hong Kong. This trade was notable for two reasons. One was it was very unusual, and it aroused the alarm bells in the Jewish community worldwide. And repeated attempts were made to try to stamp out this trade, because the Jewish community knew perfectly well that this would be a taint on their name and that it will be used against them by anti-Semitic circles. Well, it was. Although they did a great deal to try and stop the trade, where there was a supply and there was a demand, and it was through all sorts of undercover means, it was virtually impossible to stamp out until either the demand or the supply ended. Families like the Rothschilds and the Montefiore's and other families in Germany did their best to try and find out what was going on and to stop it, but it did not really stop until the Great War. Now, anti-Semitic pamphleteers, of course, seized on this trade when it became known. Anti-Semitism was extremely rife in Vienna, and it was put about that this, as it was now called, white slave traffic, consisted of Jewish procurers abducting Christian women and selling them to foreign brothels. Now, it has to be said that the women were nearly all, and in fact, as far as we know from Galician, all Jewish women and not Christian women. In fact, as far as I know, none of them were Christian women. Nevertheless, this canard survived and flourished, and it entered into the mind of an indigent painter in Vienna, or would-be painter, named Adolf Hitler, and it took root there and flowered. And if you read Mein Kampf, you find there references to this white slave traffic, which he said disgusted him and turned him, even more than perhaps he already was, into a virulent anti-Semite. Now, the trade, as I said, was pretty small compared with the global trade in women. It's estimated there were perhaps 700 to 800 Jewish girls in prostitution trafficked into Asia, and perhaps 100 pimps or procurers living off them. Some of them, indeed, were financially independent and not dependent upon pimps. They were earning their own living. But the significance of it was, of course, that it inflamed anti-Semitism not only in Europe but in other parts of the world as well. Let's come back to the lady I started with, Franziska Berger, or Bayer. Was she one of these women? Well, at first I thought it was quite probable that she was, particularly when you think of the fact that this traffic was already known to Kipling when he wrote his ballad. But there are certain things which make one wonder. The first one is that her name is not Jewish, Berger or Bayer, and the second one is that she was buried in a Protestant graveyard. Now, these are not absolutely conclusive, because many Jewish people try to disguise their nationality, or their race, I should say, for obvious reasons, because it aroused anti-Semitism. And it could be that she had changed her name. But the fact that she was buried in a Protestant graveyard suggests that she was not, in fact, Jewish. So I can have to leave that question unanswered. But I think it's time for me to stop and try to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
So we have plenty of time for questions and answers. One starting right back there. If you'll just give us your name and give us a moment to get the microphone over to you. Back on the veranda. Coming.
Thanks. My name's Andrew Wood. I'm a freelance journalist. Was talking about women being sold to brothels. And so wouldn't that mean that they were counted as slaves? And because did the authorities know about this? Did they do anything about it? Because I believe one of the first ordinances that was passed in the 1840s here in Hong Kong was the abolition of slavery. And so why wasn't that implemented, perhaps?
Well, you must also remember that when Charles Eliot came to Hong Kong, he said that it would be governed according to Chinese customs and laws. And there was a contradiction here. Theoretically, slavery has been abolished. Nevertheless, there was the practice of Mui Chai. I'm not sure, I don't think I'm saying that with the right tones, but I haven't heard it for a long time, and I've only seen it written in English, whereby parents did very often sell their children as a Chinese custom. Sometimes they sold a boy for adoption by a rich family. Often they sold their girls because they couldn't afford to keep them, and the girls became perhaps domestic servants in a household. Perhaps they were well treated, or perhaps they were sold to brothels or to procurers who then brought them up and sent them into brothels. And the practice of Mui Chai was something which was in the grey area. And for that reason, not much was done about it. There were movements that took place to try to regulate it, to accommodate Chinese customs to British law, but it didn't really happen until some time later. That's the answer. There was a contradiction.
Edith?
Well, thank you for your talk and for the book, which I've bought and intend to read. Two quick questions. One, you talk about 3 grades of prostitutes. Were these official grades? And then secondly, the licensing of this sort of highest grade of Caucasian, presumably Caucasian foreign prostitutes, how is that enacted? Or how, in other words, there were, the 19th century single female adventurers. Isabella Bird comes to mind very quickly. The Helena May here in Hong Kong was established partly to take care of the lodging issue with single women. But there were single women at least passing through before the Helena May was established. They would have had a lodging problem, but would they also have had a licensing problem?
To answer the second question first, no, I don't think so. They would have been regarded as respectable women, and I'm not quite sure how the term single European woman came to be applied, but it was certainly applied to those women who were actually licensed, or should have been licensed. Of course, they weren't necessarily all licensed, and were restricted to living in that area around Gage Street. What was the first question? Yes. Well, no, I'm sorry. They were not official grades. The grading is mine, but that is, I see what the grades were, but they were not official. The attitude towards the girls in the brothels for the local people and the transients was, just let it happen. We're not going to, theoretically, the girls should have been inspected. But as I think I mentioned, one colonial official said, we're not trying to save the Chinese from syphilis, but they were trying to save the garrison from syphilis. So that's where they became strict.
Two quick questions from me, if I may. The first is this licensing procedure. How awkward is that? So how did it actually work? Were there inspectors who came round to the brothels and doctors who came to examine the women, and were they given a certificate to do their work? Or
yes. there was an Inspector General of Brothels.
Was that an official colonial title?
I think that is the correct title, but there was such an official with such a title. I think it was perhaps the Registrar of Brothels. And there were inspections made. Later on, girls who arrived to be licensed were often, of course, underage, and the regulations, this is later on, stated that they must be at least 20. Well, these girls were coached to answer the questions by the inspector, to say, why have you come to Hong Kong? To be a prostitute. What is your age? I am 20. Okay, you're stamped.
The other question I had was, in your research, because surely there must be children and children's children of the women who were here at all the different levels or tiers of prostitution that you mentioned. Did you ever find any of these women or children of? Is there any history of recordings of that, the descendants?
With the pressure of time, I neglected to mention the protected women, who were the women living under the protection of a European. They were in effect mistresses or common law wives of European traders. I think I'm right in saying that the DGS, the Diocesan Girls' School, was founded largely to take care of the Eurasian children of such alliances. These protected women were often quite successful and were able to inherit property from the men, if the men were generous when they left or when they died. And some of them became quite good business ladies.
Again, on the veranda.
Andrew Wood again. In Singapore, there were restrictions on European women acting as prostitutes that basically, if you were British, you couldn't be a prostitute. Did they have similar restrictions in Hong Kong?
Well, the restriction was that you could not be a prostitute with Asiatic clients. Sir Frederick Lugard, who was not an unenlightened governor, in the early 20th century, wrote to the Colonial Office when the Colonial Office were trying to, under pressure from movements in England, to abolish prostitution in the colonies. He wrote back that he was not prepared to act against European prostitutes unless they behaved in an indecent manner, lived more than two to a house, or received Asiatics, all of which he regarded as scandalous. So I don't think there were actually legislation to that effect, but that was how it was treated.
Are there any records of women taking in Asiatics and then being prosecuted or losing their license?
No, I think what would have happened is that they would have been deported on some ground or other, but I don't know of any cases.
We have a question over on this side.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the very interesting talk that you have given us. Could I just make a plea? We have the title Prostitution and Prejudice, and I would like to make a plea that we all accept that the prejudice still exists, that an organization with which I work is celebrating 20 years this year of supporting sex workers in Hong Kong, and that the problems facing these women are still huge, and it is the perceptions of all of us which need to change. Thank you.
Thank you, yes. I'm sure you're right.
In this direction. Thanks, Bodine.
Hello, Bodine England here. Over here. So Actually, getting back to your book, you've obviously done a lot of research. The case actually existed in reality, and yet this is a novel. So could you talk a bit about where fact and fiction coincide or not, as the case may be?
I can tell you where they diverge. In the book, I did make the heroine a Jewish girl who had been trafficked or deceived into prostitution. And I moved the date back to 1869 rather than 1883, which coincided with the visit of the Duke of Edinburgh. I don't mean the present Duke of Edinburgh, who is of course very old, but the Duke of Edinburgh at that time, Affy, the second son of Queen Victoria. And of course I fictionalize a lot of the characters in the novel, all of the characters in the novel. And I don't think that I was too careful about the very minute details of historical accuracy. So I'm sure a historian might find that I put someone on the wrong side of the street, or left-handed when he was right-handed, or something like that. But I don't think anything seriously is amiss historically.
Hello, my name is Angus Forsyth, member of the FCC. Now you, so to speak, have cut the mustard on this and have become temporarily, in the late 19th century, an expert. Have you developed a feeling for this? Can we expect sort of 20-year segments bringing us up to date, bit by bit by bit? It's a very interesting story, and I'm sure at each 20-year period there are different angles and different aspects.
My current project is a novel set in contemporary Hong Kong, starting on June the 4th in one year and ending on June the 4th in another. And that's all I can tell you about it now. In between, stuff happens.
Over on this side. We'll try to get a little bit more out of him on that one.
Thank you. Please pardon my limited knowledge of European history at this time. I'm wondering if you could set the stage for us in terms of what the sexual mores were in Europe at the time, and what would have existed there. Was this coming to the wild, wild East? And how would you compare and contrast the picture in Hong Kong versus, say, London or Berlin at that time?
Not very different. There were brothels in pretty well every European city of any size, I should think. Certainly there were brothels in London. There were brothels in Berlin and Hamburg, well, there still are, and they're licensed. And in Eastern Europe, there's no doubt about that. I can't, I'm afraid, be very much more specific than that, but it wasn't a change from a morally superior situation to the morally inferior situation in Asia. It was exactly the same in Europe, and many of these girls were trafficked only to brothels in Eastern Europe, where there was money, in Vienna in particular.
We have a question on this side.
Just out of curiosity, why Gage Street as a, as a center for the demi-monde of this nature? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I can't be very authoritative on this, but if you went further west, you came into the area where there were brothels for the local population. So the European single European women had to be a bit separated from them. They were in fact a little bit further up the hill, as it were, both physically and reputationally. Why the police happened to choose that particular area, I cannot say. Of course, the brothels for the garrison were located mainly in Wan Chai.
We have time for one more question, Vadim.
That just reminds me, I mean, Wan Chai, the main brothel area was Spring Garden Lane, wasn't it?
That was one area.
Right, but that was, I think, that would have been in the local level brothels, or the garrison brothels would have been near Arsenal Street, or, well, because that's very organised, sort of what we now call comfort women, and think how dreadful it is that the Japanese did it and so on. But of course it was part and parcel of the British military, as with others as well.
Yeah, except I have to say that the British military establishment didn't recruit or abduct women for the brothels. They were provided by local traffickers. Yes. And I'm afraid I cannot be more specific about the location. You probably know more about that than I do. Well, you have no reason to.
We have time for one more question. Over here.
Hello. Going back to Galicia at in the late 19th century, what was the situation that drove particularly the Jewish community to suffer such poverty as opposed to any other community, and thus to drive these women to this?
It isn't altogether clear. I think it may have been a certain, well, there's always latent, and it may have been not so latent anti-Semitism there. But it's also, so far as I understand, that many of the Jewish people lived in the shtetl, and their occupation there was somehow economically no longer viable. I've never quite understood why it was no longer viable, but they were becoming impoverished so far as we know, certainly at a greater degree than the rest of the population. I cannot, I'm afraid, be any more specific about that.
I think we will leave it on that note, unless there's one more question to ask. I think there's a lot of different layers of history and food for thought. So thank you very much for joining us today. Again, I think you'll be here for a few minutes to sign books, and as a token of appreciation from the club, we'd like to present you with a gift, and we hope you'll come back and see us soon at the FCC. Thank you very much.